Welcome back to Simon and the Word. I'm Simon. This is the Word. It's not my word, it's God's Word. We're in Genesis chapter 43 and we're moving right along. Let's see what's going on here. The famine in Canaan got worse until finally Jacob's family had eaten all the grain they had bought in Egypt. So Jacob said to his sons, "Go back and buy some more grain." Judah replied, "The governor strictly warned us that we would not be allowed to see him unless we brought our youngest brother with us. If you let us take Benjamin along, we will go and buy grain, but we won't go without him." Jacob asked, "Why did you cause me so much trouble by telling the governor you had another brother?" They answered, "He asked a lot of questions about us and our family. He wanted to know if we were still alive and if we had any more brothers. If you were still alive and if we had any more brothers. All we could do was answer his questions. How could we know he would tell us to bring along our brother?" Then Judah said to his father, "Let Benjamin go with me and we will leave right away so that none of us will starve to death. I promise to bring him back safely, and if I don't, you can blame me as long as I live. If we had not wasted all this time, we could already have been there and back twice." Their father said, "If Benjamin must go with you, take the governor a gift of some of the best things from our country, such as perfume, honey, spices, pistachio nuts, and almonds. Also take along twice the amount of money for the grain, because there must have been some mistake when the money was put back in your sacks. Take Benjamin with you and leave right away. When you go in to see the governor, I pray that God All-Powerful will be good to you, and that the governor will let your other brother, and Benjamin come back home with you. If I must lose my children, I suppose I must." The brothers took the gifts, twice the amount of money, and Benjamin. Then they hurried off to Egypt. When they stood in front of Joseph, he saw Benjamin and told the servant in charge of his house, "Take these men to my house, slaughter an animal and cook it so they can eat with me at noon." The servant did as he was told and took the brothers to Joseph's house. But on the way, they got worried and started thinking, "We are being taken there because of the money that was put back in our sacks last time. He will arrest us, make us his slaves, and take our donkeys." So when they arrived at Joseph's house, they said to the servant in charge, "Sir, we came to Egypt once before to buy grain, but when we stopped for the night, we each found our grain sacks the exact amount we had paid. We have brought that money back together with enough money to buy more grain. We don't know who put the money in our sacks." "It's all right," the servant replied. "Don't worry. The God you and your father worship must have put the money there, because I received your payment in full." Then he brought Simeon out to them. Wow. All right, so that's interesting. Let's keep going here. He said, wow. All right, so the servant says, "It's all right. Don't worry. The God you and your father worship must have put the money there, because I received your payment in full." Then he brought Simeon out to them. The servant took them into Joseph's house and gave them water to wash their feet. He also tended their donkeys. The brothers got their gifts ready to give to Joseph at noon, since they had heard they were going to eat there. When Joseph came home, they gave him the gifts they had brought, and they bowed down to him. After Joseph had asked how they were, he said, "What about your elderly father? Is he still alive?" They answered, "Your servant, our father, is still alive and well." And again they bowed down to Joseph. When Joseph looked around and saw his brother Benjamin, he said, "This must be your youngest brother, the one you told me about. God bless you, my son." Right away he rushed off to his room and cried because of his love for Benjamin. He loved his little brother. After washing his face and returning, he was able to control himself and said, "Serve the meal." You can imagine, Joseph is just overwhelmed with emotion that the brothers and the brother that he loves so much, he hasn't seen him for what? We're pushing like 15, 20 years, right? That he hasn't seen them. And now all of a sudden they're back and they don't recognize him, and he's in charge. And they sold him 20 years ago to be a slave. And he's just so overwhelmed with emotion. You can imagine what it's like to be in his position, right? So let's see what happens. Joseph was served at a table by himself, and his brothers were served at another. The Egyptians sat at yet another table because Egyptians felt it was disgusting to eat with Hebrews. To the surprise of Joseph's brothers, they were seated in front of him according to their ages, from the oldest to the youngest. They were served food from Joseph's table, and Benjamin was given 5 times as much as each of the others. So Joseph's brothers drank with him and had a good time. And they still don't recognize him. They're eating with him, they're drinking with him, and they still don't recognize him. All right, we're in Genesis chapter 44. We're about 6 minutes into this episode. Let's see what's going on. Later, Joseph told the servant in charge of his house, "Fill the men's grain sacks with as much as they can hold and put their money in the sacks. Also put my silver cup in the sack of the youngest brother." The servant did as he was told. Early the next morning, the men were sent on their way with their donkeys, but they had not gone far from the city when Joseph told the servant, "Go after those men. When you catch them, say, 'My master has been good to you, so why have you stolen his silver cup?' Not only does he drink from his cup, but he also uses it to learn about the future. You have done a terrible thing." When the servant caught up with them, he said exactly what Joseph had told him to say. But they replied, "Sir, why do you say such things? We would never do anything like that. We even returned the money we found in our grain sacks when we got back to Canaan. So why would we want to steal any silver or gold from your master's house? If you find out one of us has the cup, then kill him, and the rest of us will become your slaves." "Good," the man replied, "I'll do what you have said, but only the one who has the cup will become my slave. The rest of you can go free." Each of the brothers quickly put his sack on the ground and opened it. Joseph's servant started searching the sacks, beginning with the one that belonged to the oldest brother. When he came to Benjamin's sack, he found the cup. This upset the brothers so much that they began tearing their clothes in sorrow. Then they loaded their donkeys and returned to the city. When Judah and his brothers got there, Joseph was still at home. So they bowed down to Joseph, who asked them, "What have you done? Didn't you know I could find out?" "Sir, what can we say?" Judah replied. "How can we prove we are innocent? God has shown that we are guilty. And now all of us are your slaves, especially the one who had the cup." Joseph told them, "I would never punish all of you. Only the one who was caught with the cup will become my slave. The rest of you are free to go home to your father." Judah went over to Joseph and said, "Sir, you have as much power as the king himself, and I am only your slave. Please don't get angry if I speak. You asked if our father was still alive and if we had any more brothers. So we told you, our father is a very old man. In fact, he was already old when Benjamin was born. Benjamin's brother is dead. Now Benjamin is the only one of the brothers who is still alive, and our father loves him very much. You ordered us to bring him here so you could see him for yourself. We told you that our father would die if Benjamin left him, but you warned us that we could never see you again unless our youngest brother came with us. So we returned to our father and reported what you had said. Later, our father told us to come back here and buy more grain. But we answered, 'We can't go back to Egypt without our youngest brother. We will never be let in to see the governor unless he is with us.' Sir, our father then reminded us that his favorite wife had given birth to 2 sons. One of them was already missing and had not been seen for a long time. My father thinks the boy was torn to pieces by some wild animal, and he said, 'I am an old man. If you take Benjamin from me and something happens to him, I will die of a broken heart. That's why Benjamin must be with us when I go back to my father. He loves him so much that he will die if Benjamin doesn't come back with me. I promised my father that I would bring him safely home. If I don't, I told my father he could blame me the rest of my life. Sir, I am your slave. Please let me stay here in place of Benjamin and let him return home with his brothers. How can I face my father if Benjamin isn't with me? I couldn't bear to see my father in such sorrow." Genesis chapter 45. Since Joseph could no longer control his feelings in front of his servants, he sent them out of the room. When he was alone with his brothers, he told them, "I am Joseph." Then he cried so loudly that the Egyptians heard him and told about it in the king's palace. Joseph asked his brothers if his father was still alive, but they were too frightened to answer. Joseph told them to come closer to him, and when they did, he said, "Yes, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold to Egypt. Don't worry or blame yourselves for what you did. God is the one who sent me ahead of you to save lives. There has already been a famine for 2 years, and for 5 more years no one will plow fields or harvest grain. But God sent me on ahead of you to keep your families alive and to save you in this wonderful way. After all, you weren't really the ones who sent me here. It was God. He made me the highest official in the king's court and placed me over all Egypt. Now hurry back and tell my father that his son Joseph says, 'God has made me ruler of Egypt.' Come here as quickly as you can. You will live near me in the region of Goshen with your children and grandchildren, as well as with your sheep, goats, cattle, and everything else you own. I will take care of you there during the next 5 years of famine. But if you don't come, you and your family and your animals will starve to death. All of you, including my brother Benjamin, can tell by what I have said that I really am Joseph. Tell my father about my great power here in Egypt and about everything you have seen. Hurry and bring him here." Joseph and Benjamin hugged each other and started crying. Joseph was still crying as he kissed each of his brothers. After this, they started talking with Joseph. When it was told in the palace that Joseph's brothers had come, the king and his officials were happy. So the king said to Joseph, "Tell your brothers to load their donkeys and return to Canaan. Have them bring their father and their families here. I will give them the best land in Egypt, and they can eat and enjoy everything that grows on it. Also tell your brothers to take some wagons from Egypt for their wives and children to ride in, and be sure to have them bring their father. They can leave their possessions behind because they will be given the best of everything in Egypt." Jacob's sons agreed to do what the king had said, and Joseph gave them wagons and food for their trip home, just as the king had ordered. Joseph gave some new clothes to each of his brothers, but to Benjamin he gave 5 new outfits and 300 pieces of silver. To his father he sent 10 donkeys loaded with the best things in Egypt, and 10 other donkeys loaded with grain and bread and other food for the trip home. Then he sent his brothers off and told them, "Don't argue on the way home." Joseph's brothers left Egypt, and when they arrived in Canaan, they told their father that Joseph was still alive and was the ruler of Egypt. But their father was so surprised that he could not believe them. Then they told him everything Joseph had said. When he saw the wagons Joseph had sent, he felt much better and said, "Now I can believe you. My son Joseph must really be alive, and I will get to see him before I die." Wow. He hasn't seen his son in 20-something years, thought he was dead, and now he finds out he's the ruler of Egypt. What a turnaround, huh? We're in Genesis chapter 46. Moving right along, let's see what's going on. Jacob packed up everything he owned and left for Egypt. On the way, he stopped near the town of Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God his father Isaac has worshipped. That night, God spoke to him and said, "Jacob, Jacob." "Here I am," Jacob answered. God said, "I am God, the same God your father worshipped. Don't be afraid to go to Egypt. I will give you so many descendants that one day they will become a nation. I will go with you to Egypt, and later I will bring your descendants back here. Your son Joseph will be at your side when you die." Jacob and his family set out from Beersheba and headed for Egypt. His sons put him in the wagon that the king had sent for him, and they put their small children and their wives in the other wagons. Jacob's whole family went to Egypt, including his sons, his grandsons, his daughters, and his granddaughters. They took along their animals and everything else they owned. When Jacob went to Egypt, his children who were born in northern Syria also went with their families. Jacob and his wife Leah had a total of 33 children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, but 2 of their grandchildren had died in Canaan. Their oldest son Reuben took his sons Hanok, Pula, Hezron, and Camri. Their son Simeon. So Jacob's 12 sons. These are the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. Their oldest son Reuben took his son Hanok, Palu, Hezron, and Camri. Their son Simeon took his sons Jemuel, Jamin, Ohad, Hachin, Zohar, and Shaul, whose mother was a Canaanite. Their son Levi took his sons Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. Their son Judah took his sons Shelah, Perez, and Zerah. Judah's sons and Onan had died in Canaan. Judah's son Perez took his sons Hezron and Hamul. Their son Issachar took his sons Tola, Puva, Jashub, and Shimron. Their son Zebulun took his sons Zered, Elon, and Jaleel. Their daughter Dinah also went. Jacob and Zilpah, the servant woman Laban had given his daughter Leah, had a total of 16 children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Their son Gad took his sons Ziphion, Haggai, Shuni, Esbon, Eri, Erodi, and Erelai. Their son Asher took his sons Imnah, Ishvi, and Bera, who took his sons Heber and Malchiel. Sarah, the daughter of Asher, also went. Jacob and Rachel had 14 children and grandchildren. Their son Joseph was already in Egypt, where he had married Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, the priest of Heliopolis. Joseph and Asenath had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Jacob and Rachel's son Benjamin took his sons Bela, Becher, Ashbel, Gera, Naaman, Ehi, Rosh, Mupim, Hupim, and Ard. Jacob and Bilhah, the servant woman Laban had given his daughter Rachel, had 7 children and grandchildren. Their son Dan took his son Hushim. Their son Naphtali took his sons Jaziel, Guni, Jezer, and Shelem. 66 members of Jacob's family went to Egypt with him, not counting his daughters-in-law. Jacob's 2 grandsons who were born there made it a total of 70 members of Jacob's family in Egypt. Jacob had sent his son Judah ahead of him to ask Joseph to meet them in Goshen. So Joseph got in his chariot and went to meet his father. When they met, Joseph hugged his father around the neck and cried for a long time. Jacob said to Joseph, "Now that I have seen you and know you are still alive, I am ready to die." Then Joseph said to his brothers and to everyone who had come with them, "I must go and tell the king that you have arrived from Canaan. I will tell him that you are shepherds and that you have brought your sheep, goats, cattle, and everything else you own. The king will call you in and ask you what you do for a living. When he does, be sure to say, 'We are shepherds. Our families have always raised sheep.' If you tell him this, he will let you settle in the region of Goshen." Joseph wanted them to say this to the king because the Egyptians did not like to be around anyone who raised sheep. Joseph took 5 of his brothers to the king and told him, "My father and my brothers have come from Canaan. They have brought their sheep, goats, cattle, and everything else they own to the region of Goshen." Then he introduced his brothers to the king, who asked them, "What do you do for a living?" "Sir, we are shepherds," was their answer. "Our families have always raised sheep. But in our country all the pastures are dried up and our sheep have no grass to eat. So we, your servants, have come here. Please let us live in the region of Goshen." The king said to Joseph, "It's good that your father and brothers have arrived. I will let them live anywhere they choose in the land of Egypt. But I suggest that they settle in Goshen, the best part of our land. I would also like your finest shepherds to watch after my own sheep and goats." Then Joseph brought his father Jacob and introduced him to the king. Jacob gave the king his blessing, and the king asked him, "How old are you?" Jacob answered, "I have lived only 130 years, and I have had to move from place to place. My parents and my grandparents also had to move from place to place, but they lived much longer, and their life was not as hard as mine." Then Jacob gave the king his blessing once again and left. Joseph obeyed the king's orders, and gave his father and brothers some of the best land in Egypt near the city of Ramses. Joseph also provided food for their families. The famine was bad everywhere in Egypt and Canaan, and the people were suffering terribly. So Joseph sold them the grain that had been stored up, and he put the money in the king's treasury. But when everyone had run out of money, the Egyptians came to Joseph and demanded, "Give us more grain. If you don't, we'll soon be dead because our money's all gone." "If you don't have any money," Joseph answered, "give me your animals, and I'll let you have some grain." From then on, they brought him their horses and donkeys and their sheep and goats in exchange for grain. Within a year, Joseph had collected every animal in Egypt. Then the people came to him and said, "Sir, there's no way we can hide the truth from you. We are broke, and we don't have any more animals. We have nothing left except ourselves and our land. Don't let us starve and our land be ruined. If you'll give us grain to eat and seed to plant, we'll sell ourselves and our land to the king. We'll become his slaves." The famine became so severe that Joseph finally bought every piece of land in Egypt for the king and made everyone the king's slaves, except the priests. The king gave the priests their regular food allowance, so they did not have to sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "You and your land now belong to the king. I'm giving you seed to plant, but 1/5 of your crops must go to the king. You can keep the rest as seed or as food for your families." "Sir, you have saved our lives," they answered. "We are glad to be slaves of the king." Then Joseph made a law that 1/5 of the harvest would always belong to the king. Only the priests did not lose their land. The people of Israel made their home in the land of Goshen, where they became prosperous and had large families. Jacob himself lived there for 17 years before dying at the age of 147. When Jacob knew he did not have long to live, he called in Joseph and said, "If you really love me, you must make a solemn promise not to bury me in Egypt. Instead, bury me in the place where my ancestors are buried." "I will do what you have asked," Joseph answered. "Will you give me your word?" Jacob asked. "Yes, I will," Joseph promised. After this, Jacob bowed down and prayed at the head of his bed. I think we're going to call it there for this episode, and we'll be back with chapters 48 through 50 really soon.